All right, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining me today for another presentation as part of the GreyLearning Live webinar series. Lots of great comments in the chat here, including Lori from Nashville. I'm just down the road in Franklin, so thanks for the local join and somebody coming from different countries all over the world. Thank you very much. I'm excited about today's presentation. For me, at least, I know it's going to be a lot of fun. I hope for you it's fun, entertaining, and I suppose more importantly, informative. And part of the reason that I'm excited about today's presentation is that I know this has been a subject of a little bit of confusion, shall we say, when it comes to the different software that Adobe offers for organizing, optimizing, and sharing your photos. And so I'm certainly going to try to cut through that confusion as best I can, and if I'm being honest, maybe poke a little bit of fun at some of that confusion in terms of the different tools that are available and what's changed. There's been some recent developments, and then also helping you to get a better sense of how you might make a decision. And I see that continuing to pipe in with the comments, Knoxville, not too far down the road. And then around the country, Illinois, New Mexico, California, my original home state. So thanks very much for all of you joining. I'm looking forward to this presentation. Focused on, the title, I guess in some ways says it all, at least if you're familiar with the landscape here. Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, or Bridge. And I thought, I'd add an also known as an AKA title here, them's fighting words, because I do find that so often photographers shall we say, might argue, hopefully with some fun, in jest maybe a little bit, in good spirits anyway, but argue over which solution might be right. I know oftentimes when I'm answering questions in the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter about Lightroom Classic, and the question relates to some problem with the catalog, some issue where a photographer got into a mess in part because of the catalog, which I'll certainly talk about in today's presentation. I often get some emails, snarky emails saying that's why I don't use Lightroom Classic. And I absolutely understand that. We're going to talk about that issue today. And I think the key thing to understand is that there are different issues, different things that are important for each photographer. And so there's not a single right answer for all photographers, so certainly keep that in mind. And hopefully today I'll help you to figure out what the right answer might be for you, perhaps both now and in the future, as things will continue to certainly change for sure. And I saw it mentioned earlier, someone mentioned the photo of me sitting on the cliff over the Grand Canyon, which actually I thought was an appropriate photo. I try to remember to introduce myself, and I usually forget that. I just assume that if you're coming to my presentation, you probably know who I am, but that's not always the case, obviously. Hopefully some of you are sharing the links to these presentations with some of your friends who are photographers who might benefit from the presentations. But I thought, appropriate for me to be sitting on a cliff here, on the edge, as it were, talking about these different tools and some of the challenges. But for those of you who are not familiar, I know many of you receive my daily Ask Tim Gray email newsletter, question and answer format that I have been publishing now for more than 22 years. Just hearing myself say the words, it still is a bit surprising that, well, number one, that an email newsletter has existed for so long, and perhaps more surprising is that so many photographers thankfully appreciate those emails in their inbox. So thank you very much for that. If you're not already getting the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter, by the way, you can just go to asktimgray.com. And there's a field over on the right-hand side where you can enter in your email so that you can start getting those daily, well, weekdays anyway, question and answer emails. And I do want to mention, by the way, some of you already have signed up, and I appreciate that I have a couple of new courses now. I had recently finished a new comprehensive course on Lightroom Classic. I've just, in the last, it's been less than a week now, finished up a course on the cloud-based version of Lightroom, the other version of Lightroom, and that through Friday. So I did want to extend, I mentioned that as soon as 100% of the course was published, the price would go up to $79. It's still just $39, and that'll continue through Friday so that those of you joining this presentation will be able to take advantage of that. If you just go to greylearning.com, both of those courses are on the homepage, and so you can check into them, and hopefully after today's presentation, you'll get a better sense of which might be the better fit for you. Along the way today, I do want to encourage you, if you have questions, feel free to submit those. If you point your web browser at timgray.me, make sure it's timgray.me, not a .com, but a timgray.me/question. That is a bit.ly link, a shortcut link that will take you to a Google form where you can fill in, your name and email address if you'd like, but more importantly, your question. If I don't get to your question today, I will do my best to cover as many of those in upcoming editions of the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter so that you'll still be able to get the answer even if I didn't get a chance to talk about it today. But I will try to cover as much of that as I can. And I also want to talk about the bigger picture here to start off with. So of course we're here to talk about Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, and Adobe Bridge. We'll get to those apps in just a moment here. But I also wanted to emphasize that these applications are part of a larger Creative Cloud I'm going to use the word ecosystem because that's a word that I will come back to a little bit later. But there are a variety of applications. And in some cases, the answer is fairly clear. Now, for me personally, I use a pretty good percentage of the Adobe applications I have over the years. Things like using InDesign to produce Pixology magazine and Premiere Pro and Audition to edit the videos for my various courses, and of course Lightroom Classic and some of the other tools. And in a lot of cases, things are pretty clear in terms of if you're an Adobe user, if you're going to sign up for the Creative Cloud for any of the plans, but in this case, looking more broadly at the All Apps plan, and you need to create some well-designed documents. For example, when I publish issues of Pixology magazine, those are produced using InDesign. Which other Adobe application would you use to create a digital magazine? InDesign is your choice. Very simple. What if you needed to edit complex videos? There are more than one solution, but when it comes to really sort of high-end video editing in the Adobe family, it simply boils down to Premiere Pro. Very simple question to answer. And what about creating fancy illustrations, vector graphics? Then you might want to use Adobe Illustrator. And in the Adobe family, this is pretty much the solution you're going to use for vector graphics. What about editing audio like a pro? Maybe you've got a podcast or you're editing audio to put to a slideshow presentation of your photos, whatever the case might be. Adobe Audition. In each of these cases, we've got a single answer. And even if you need to edit photos with maximum control, one of my favorite things is to be a control freak when it comes to my photos and really be able to optimize them. Well, in that scenario, it's pretty straightforward. We use Photoshop, which has been around for what has it been now? A quarter of a century, probably a little bit longer than that. I forget what year it actually got started. But what about if you need to organize and optimize tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands or more of your photos and they are super important to you? Then what are you going to use? It depends, which is one of the things we're here to address today. Do we use Lightroom? Do we use Lightroom Classic? Do we use Bridge? And that's not even including the other option that's out there, which is the Photoshop Elements Organizer. So I could have made this presentation even more complicated by talking about the Elements Organizer, which is a perfectly decent organizational tool for photographers. But today we're going to focus on Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, and Bridge. And so those are the contenders, as it were, in the context of today's presentation. So let's talk just a little bit about each of those and kind of get a general sense of what they are. I'll share more details. I'm going to go into a live demo, in fact, today and show you the software, give you a better sense of what's possible within these various tools. And so Lightroom started off, and this, I was going to say I love this, the amusement of this confusion, but in reality, it is a frustrating thing that we have Lightroom and Lightroom Classic, and there's even more confusion, which I'll get to a little bit later. But the non-classic version of Lightroom, because Lightroom Classic used to be called Lightroom, then they came out with Lightroom, and so the previous Lightroom had to have a new name to distinguish it from Lightroom, and so it became Lightroom Classic and Lightroom. I don't know who thought this was a good idea. I certainly did not. But we do have the situation. So we've got the cloud-focused, I used to call this the cloud-based version of Lightroom, but the cloud-focused version of Lightroom. And it started off as cloud-exclusive. And part of the reason that I just got finished producing a brand new comprehensive course on this version of Lightroom is that it's been updated. And part of the reason I wanted to present this webinar is that Lightroom's been updated to the point that it's no longer cloud exclusive. It used to be that every photo you manage with Lightroom is stored in the cloud, is stored on Adobe servers. You don't store it locally on your own hard drive, you don't have folders, but that's changed now, and we can browse local files, and I'll demonstrate that for you shortly if you haven't had a chance to take a look at that. And the Lightroom application also includes both organization and optimization. And optimization is one area that we all, I think, can sort of agree on, that we don't have to argue, and more on that a little bit later as well. And a little bit of sharing. And so Lightroom, what had been the cloud-based version, is not necessarily a complete tool for all photographers. For example, you cannot print directly from within the Lightroom application. So there certainly are some limitations in that regard, but for organizing and optimizing your photos, it certainly has a lot to offer. The Lightroom Classic application is catalog focused. It is not cloud focused. It is catalog focused. And the reason I say that rather than that it's just local focused is that it's important to appreciate that there is a catalog involved in Lightroom Classic. Lightroom Classic is unique in that regard. Lightroom Classic has a catalog that is separate from the photos. The analogy that I usually use, I guess it dates me a little bit, harkening back to my early days, my childhood days, going to the library to check out books. And so I think about the card catalog and the shelves that contain the books. And so the catalog in Lightroom Classic is the card catalog. The books are your photos on the hard drive rather than books on the shelf. And in essence, the two are separate. And so in the library, you go to the card catalog to look up information about a book, to find a book and get its number, using that Dewey Decimal System. And then you go to the appropriate shelf and you find the book. And in Lightroom Classic, it's similar to that. So now imagine if you lost the card catalog. You would not have the information to help you find your photos anymore. It's not quite as dire as that, but just to use that analogy. But you could still go browsing the shelves. There's still categories, there's still sections, the folder structure, for example, in the context of photos. So it might take a little bit more time, but you could still go find your photos because the photos are separated. Whereas if you lost the photos, now the card catalog is pretty much useless. And more importantly, let's say someone goes into the card catalog and shuffles all the cards, puts them all in the wrong order. Now you can't find your books. Now you don't know how to make heads or tails of the information that's in that catalog, for example. And so that's sort of the analogy that I use in terms of understanding that, in Lightroom Classic, if you make changes outside of Lightroom on your hard drive, you're going to create a huge problem for yourself, potentially, within Lightroom Classic. It's one of the reasons photographers like to make fun of Lightroom Classic. It's one of the reasons that some photographers avoid Lightroom Classic. I understand that. It also represents one of the greatest advantages of Lightroom Classic, as I'll demonstrate here shortly. And I should also mention, by the way, Lightroom Classic has more. I almost used the word better, and I caught myself. It's not better sharing necessarily, but it is more sharing. So, for example, in Lightroom, we have the print module where you can print your photos, the book module where you can generate books that you can publish with Blurb, the slideshow module so you can create slideshows, and the web module that's often referred to as the module that nobody ever actually uses in Lightroom Classic. And you can also export photos in a variety of ways. So more flexibility in terms of sharing from Lightroom Classic. Mostly that translates into easier printing because many of the other modules for sharing just don't get used all that much. And then finally, we have Adobe Bridge. And I know, I'm not sure if my buddy Jeff is here. He usually likes to chime in about Adobe Bridge and not going to Lightroom Classic, understandably. But Bridge is sort of, in a way, the simplest of these options because in many respects, Adobe Bridge is just a browser. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I just mean that it literally is a browser. You point to a folder and Bridge says, here's the pictures in that folder. One of the side effects of that is that it's a little bit slower to browse photos. It will build a cache, so there are some ways that we can work around some of those limitations. But if you have a batch of photos that you haven't worked with in a while, they might not be in the cache. Now you go browse and you've got to wait for the previews to build, for example. Or filtering images might take a little bit longer because Bridge has to analyze everything that is out on the hard drive rather than looking to a central catalog. So there's some inherent limitations with Adobe Bridge in that regard, but it also makes it really simple. And a simple workflow can be a really good thing. And by simple, I just mean that the software itself is relatively simple and straightforward. Not a lot of bells and whistles, but you still have the various tools when it comes to, for example, organizing your photos. In fact, you still have, as I addressed recently, I know it was in an Ask Tim Gray email newsletter, I think I also covered that in Pixology, in a recent issue of Pixology magazine, but we also have the ability to create collections within Adobe Bridge. The limitation in Adobe Bridge when it comes to collections is that the source images have to currently be available in order for you to see the images in the collections. A little bit of a minor issue there, which again is owing to the lack of a catalog. Tim, I see your comment there about the audio. Hopefully that was just a brief little interruption because it looks like our stream is healthy. But do keep in mind, by the way, that the recording will be available. And, oh, good. Thank you, Berlin. So the recording will be available after the fact, which I didn't mention prior to getting started here, but I know most of you realize that that's the case. All right, so those are our chief contenders, Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, and Bridge. It's the reason we're having this conversation right now, essentially. And but I want to take a little brief detour, a little bit of an aside, and talk briefly about the Lightroom ecosystem. In fact, this is a question that I was just asked, and I don't remember. It either was in an Ask Tim Gray email newsletter, possibly today, or it might be tomorrow's answer that I recently answered. But the Lightroom ecosystem, and what I mean by that was one of the questions that came up. And what I mean is the collection of applications, I'm going to use that term fairly loosely, in terms of Lightroom Classic, plus Lightroom, plus Lightroom, plus Lightroom. How did I do? I tried to I tried to say all that with a straight face. So we've got Lightroom Classic, Lightroom, Lightroom, and Lightroom. Anybody confused? Why do we have 3 Lightrooms? Well, there's actually different versions of Lightroom, if you will. So I already mentioned this confusion between Lightroom Classic and Lightroom. We often have referred to as Lightroom Cloud. I certainly have referred to it as Lightroom Cloud. Now that's not such a good name for it because, or nickname I should say, because it's not exclusively focused on cloud-based storage. So now what do we call it? Lightroom, not Classic. You know, it gets challenging as an educator to try to talk about these different tools and not confuse you, and also not have to say Lightroom, the one that's not Lightroom Classic, but rather is primarily focused on cloud-based storage. That's a mouthful. So what are we talking about here? Lightroom Classic, we already addressed. Lightroom, the desktop application, that's what we're primarily here to talk about. But then there's sort of 2 other versions of Lightroom. There's Lightroom Mobile, which is Lightroom that you can get on your mobile device, and there's also Lightroom in a web browser. And by the way, should I point out maybe that Lightroom, the cloud-based version, it's really in the About dialog. It is called Adobe Photoshop Lightroom. The Lightroom mobile app is just called Lightroom. The web version doesn't really have a name. It uses the Lightroom logo, but it doesn't really brand itself with a particular name. And so really all of them are just called Lightroom. And we have to clarify, I use the term Lightroom Mobile and Lightroom Web, for example. For Lightroom Desktop, I usually still say Lightroom Cloud or the cloud-focused version of Lightroom. It gets to be confusing. I understand that. I was going to say I appreciate that, but I don't appreciate that the confusion exists, but I do acknowledge that it exists because of the way this ecosystem has been defined. And so for now, we're not going to be talking about mobile and web. It's just the 2 desktop applications. Those are both, they get installed on your computer, you run them locally. The real difference in terms of storage is whether you're managing, in the case of Lightroom Classic, you're managing your photos 100% on local hard drives, and with the cloud-based version of Lightroom, you're mostly, partially at least, to some extent, or maybe not at all. It's one of the odd things with the update to the cloud-based version is you don't have to use cloud-based storage at all if you don't want to. And so things have gotten a little bit more murky in that regard. But that's also actually a good thing, though, because what it really boils down to is that the cloud-based version is growing up, and it's able to manage local files as well. So let's take a look. I'm going to give you a little bit of a demo of Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, and Adobe Bridge in order to take a look, to give you hopefully a better sense of which one might be the right fit for you, or which one you might consider, the one you might look at moving forward, because things are continuing to change. I'll talk about some of the limitations of the cloud-based version of Lightroom, for example. Those limitations probably won't exist forever. And yes, I'm just looking real quickly to see some of the questions here. I'll come back to those a little bit later, because first I do want to get to this demo, but do feel free. I'll bring up that slide again, as a matter of fact, if you've got any questions that you'd like me to cover. Again, if I don't get a chance to address them today, I'll do my best to cover as many of them as possible today. But if I don't, do stay tuned in upcoming editions of my Ask Tim Gray email newsletter, and I will most certainly make an effort to cover those questions in the email. Or if it's just a really good question anyway, even if I answer it today, maybe I'll throw it in to an Ask Tim Gray email newsletter in order to give you to give the broader audience the benefit of the answer in the case of questions that I find to be especially helpful. All right, and so I just caught Tommy's comment here. Lightroom iPad, that would just be Lightroom Mobile, because it's the same version of Lightroom effectively that runs on smartphones as well as on tablets, so iPad and Android tablets. And see the other comment here, map module, good point, because that's one of my favorites in the Lightroom Classic version of these various forms of Lightroom. So, all right, so let's take a look at Lightroom, in this case, the non-classic version of Lightroom. And I actually want to start off by talking about the adjustment process, the optimization workflow, the editing or develop, whatever term you want to use. I generally use the term optimizing. So when we're going to be optimizing our photos, making them look their best. And I mentioned earlier, this is one of the things we can all agree on, sort of, meaning that across all of these applications that we're looking at, we have the same basic workflow in terms of optimizing our photos. And so let me hide my face here so we can see the interface over here on the right-hand side. So this is Lightroom, the cloud-based version of sorts. So Lightroom that's not classic. And over on the right side, we have this toolbar with our various panels, the sections as it were, that are available. And so on the edit panel, we have the light adjustments, and we've got down here the color adjustments and effects and detail and optics and lens blur. And so I'm assuming that most of you, perhaps even all of you, have used either Camera Raw or the Develop module in Lightroom Classic, or you have adjusted images in the cloud-based version of Lightroom. In effect, all three are exactly the same. Are they really exactly the same? No, not quite. So sort of, in fact, let me turn off my single panel mode here just so that I can do a little bit of simple scrolling, and I want you to see effects here as well. So not that you have to memorize these sliders, but if you sort of notice, if you're familiar with the basic tonal adjustments here in the light section, and then the temperature and tint, for example, as well as vibrant saturation. And then way down here, we find texture, clarity, and dehaze. Well, if we switch over to, let's find a raw capture here, switch over to Lightroom Classic and go into the Develop module, then we'll find the exact same controls, but not laid out in the exact same way. And so we have the basic section, and that includes our tone or our light adjustments, our white balance, and our vibrant saturation, which would be the color adjustments, and this little subset of presence controls, which are found in effects in the cloud-based version of Lightroom. And so there is a difference in appearance, but not a difference in functionality. To clarify that just a little bit, though, minor differences in functionality with different variations in the version number and timing. Sometimes features come out in Lightroom Cloud faster than Lightroom Classic, and in some cases vice versa. So it's not always 100% on par at every given moment, but eventually they do catch up with each other. In the context of using Adobe Bridge, which I'm not going to demonstrate at the moment just because I have enough applications running on my computer. I don't want to enter Photoshop into the mix as well. But if I were to double-click a raw capture in Adobe Bridge, for example, one of two things will happen. Either Photoshop will launch and the Camera Raw dialog will come up, Or if you've set a preference in Bridge to essentially open the Camera Raw interface sort of directly in Bridge, I mean, it's still a separate, I sort of think of it like a plugin. It's sort of its own standalone thing, but you can open Camera Raw via Bridge without actually bringing up Photoshop. But Bridge, bringing up Camera Raw, would be the equivalent of working in the quote-unquote cloud-based version of Lightroom, in that Camera Raw, for those of you who have been using Camera Raw, you probably already recognize that the interface with Camera Raw and the cloud-based version of Lightroom is virtually identical. Whereas with Lightroom Classic, as we've already seen, there's a bit of a difference when it comes to those adjustments in the Develop module. So keep that in mind just as a reference that when it comes to optimizing, all three are the same. In effect, if you're familiar at all with Photoshop, in effect, all three of these solutions, you can think of them as having Camera Raw built into them. In some cases, that's sort of literally true, the Develop module in Lightroom Classic, or the Edit panel, for example, in Lightroom. With Bridge, it's sort of technically separate, but you can think of it as being built in. So all three have Camera Raw. So they all three have the exact same optimization capabilities, and in all three cases, if you want to go beyond that, you would send the photo over to Photoshop. When it comes to organizing, that's where things are a bit different. And so that's what I want to focus on in a little bit more detail. And I want to start off with the cloud-based version of Lightroom. And so when we're working with cloud, so now we have the cloud tab as well as the local tab, so we can browse images either that are stored in the cloud or that are stored locally. And so cloud-based storage, we would upload photos. So for example, if we use the Add Photos feature, if we're on the Cloud tab and we add photos to Lightroom, it's sort of like importing into the catalog in Lightroom Classic. We are adding the photos to our cloud-based storage. What does that mean? Well, it used to mean in Lightroom that every single photo that you're managing is getting stored on Adobe servers, using up storage space that you have a limit for, so you might have to pay a higher fee each month as you go beyond, for example, 1 terabyte or even lesser, depending on your particular plan that you've signed up for. But you can get a terabyte option with the photography plan, for example. And depending on your camera, that might be somewhere in the general vicinity of perhaps 20,000 images, give or take. And so there's an inherent limitation in that regard, but all those photos are stored in the cloud. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, they're stored in the cloud, but local copies are created as needed, but primarily everything's in the cloud. The advantage of that is that you've got remote storage and Adobe is backing everything up for you, and so presumably that's going to keep those photos safe. It also means that you can access all of those photos from anywhere, literally. If you've got a desktop computer at home and you've got a laptop that you travel with, you can have the Lightroom desktop application installed on both. You can also use your smartphone or your tablet. So I can pull up the Lightroom app on my smartphone or on my tablet, and I can browse all of these photos. In fact, if I went to while I'm talking about that, I'll go ahead and bring that up, and I can just at least, give you a quick glance without actually sharing my screen here. But let's go to all photos here, and let's scroll all the way to the left, and that'll be down here at the bottom. And so if I then hold this up, maybe you can kind of sort of see, if I can go backwards, that we've got the same photos, the motorcycles and this roof peak and the umbrellas there, that are all available. So I can access those photos on my mobile device, and I can also browse those in a web browser from literally anywhere with an internet connection. Just go to lightroom.adobe.com, sign in with your Adobe ID, and in my case, I would be seeing, now this is just a demo library, so I would see all 197 of my photos that have been actually shared to the cloud. But in addition to that cloud-based storage, I can also take advantage of local storage. Now, the drawback to cloud-based storage is primarily the way it's organized in my view. So with cloud-based photos, I'm going to switch to the grid view here, for example. These are all cloud-based photos, and I can sort them, I can filter them, but it's just all of my pictures. So now imagine if I took my Lightroom Classic catalog and migrated it to Lightroom Cloud, which is a feature in Lightroom Cloud. You can migrate your Lightroom Classic catalog over so that in one step you're up and running. I have almost 400,000 photos in my Lightroom Classic catalog. I don't need to be able to have 400,000 photos in the cloud so that I can access them on my smartphone or in a web browser. And furthermore, I want to make sure that I'm as organized as possible. And so the lack of a folder structure, because in the cloud, everything is just stored in one place effectively. And so the way that we organize in the cloud-based version of Lightroom for cloud-based photos is to use albums. If you've used Lightroom Classic, this is the exact same thing as a collection. They just use a different name because I'm going to go out on a limb and say Adobe wants you to be confused. Just a guess. No, but they are referred to as different things: collections in Lightroom Classic, albums in Lightroom and in Adobe Bridge. And so it behooves you then, if you're using cloud-based storage with Lightroom, that every time you add photos, you want to make an album. You want to give those photos a meaning in terms of a group. Now, sometimes, for me, that tends to be fairly easy because it's usually a trip, right? Here's photos from a trip to Europe in 2023, and here's photos from a trip to Easter Island, and here's some Palouse favorites or whatever the case might be. And so as I import new photos, they're typically from a photo trip, so it can be relatively easy. But that also can start to get a little bit unwieldy where we have albums. Now, we do have folders for those albums or groups for those albums so that, for example, we can kind of consolidate albums into little sets. But that does, in my mind, introduce a little bit of a challenge. But with the recent update, you're no longer limited to only using cloud-based storage when it comes to this Lightroom desktop application. The cloud-based version of Lightroom is no longer exclusively cloud-based. I can go to the local tab, and now I can just go browse any of my photos. So if I go into, well, let's take a look. We've got some sample photos from the course that I just produced, for example. And so I can see the photos that or the folders, I should say, that I've identified as my favorites. And so I can go through and see those different pictures. Or if I drill down a little bit further into the pictures folder and my demo photos folder, and now I have a variety of different folders. And so all of these, you notice some of these, the previews are building on the fly, because these folders happen to have not yet been browsed with Lightroom. It will all be cached. So here we saw that the photos needed to load. Then if I switch to a different folder and come back to this folder, notice everything's instantaneous. So there will be a local cache created. In fact, once I've browsed photos, if I can see my photos in Lightroom and then I quit, then I disconnect my computer from the internet and I launch and go back, in this case, to cloud-based photos, and I launch Lightroom again with no internet connection, my cloud-based photos will still be here. Obviously, local photos will still be there because they're local, but the point is that I can then take advantage of that cloud-based storage and still work with my local photos. In fact, I could even, while I'm disconnected from the internet, I could make adjustments here in Lightroom. When I reconnect to the internet, those changes will synchronize to the cloud, and they'll therefore synchronize to my other devices, so to my smartphone, for example, so that I have all of those updates. So it's more flexible than you might assume based on cloud-based storage, even though with Lightroom Cloud, the photos that are on the Cloud tab are primarily stored on Adobe servers. As long as I have adequate storage space locally, the photos that I've been working with recently are all going to be cached locally. Possibly all of my photos will be cached locally. And so some photographers might consider, for example, using this hybrid approach. So in Lightroom Classic, for example, which we'll take a look at in a moment, we primarily revolve around local folder-based storage, but then you can selectively choose what you're going to synchronize to the cloud so that it'll be available on your mobile device, for example, or Lightroom in a web browser. But now that we have this local tab, it is very feasible as a photographer that you could browse, you could manage most of your photos locally with a folder structure, something along these lines. This is just a demo set of photos, so it's not necessarily the best example of what your folder structure might look like. But I can simply browse my local folders, and then those photos that I want to have in the cloud for whatever reason, I can upload to the cloud. And so, for example, let's say, do we have any decent photos in here? If I've got, let's just say this picture and I want to make it available in the cloud for whatever reason, I could copy this single photo. So up here at the top right, we've got this copy one photo to cloud button. Or I can also do the same basic thing. I could take an entire folder and copy it to the cloud. So right click on a folder, copy it to the cloud. In my course, I talked about a workflow that I recommend using to help you stay organized with this approach. So you don't want to get confused about which images are in the cloud versus not. But I did that, for example, with, which folder was it? I think it was, yes, Easter Island. So the Easter Island, I did that for the entire folder. So just right click on the folder and copy it to the cloud. And now I have all of these images, videos, whatever the case might be. All of that is in the cloud. And so that gives me that benefit of being able to pick and choose. And so as a photographer, if Lightroom, the non-classic version, otherwise looks interesting to you, then keep in mind, you could only use local storage, treat it like a web browser, or you could only use cloud-based storage, or you could use a hybrid, a mix of both. And so that you've got the flexibility of being able to pick and choose with this overall sort of integrated approach. Notice I'm not having to switch modules. And so if I find a photo that I want to work on, I don't have to switch to the develop module. My editing controls are just right here over on the right side. And if I want to look at different photos, I can just switch to different photos. I don't have as much flexibility in terms of some of the features that are available in Lightroom Classic, but I do have a lot, and I do have a simpler interface, a simpler workflow, and no catalog. So if you're looking to ditch the catalog in Lightroom Classic, but still take advantage of many of the same basic benefits, then Lightroom, especially now with that local browsing capability, it makes things more interesting, and I think makes it a more viable solution for photographers. And then taking a look at Lightroom. So the catalog is something that a lot of photographers have perceived as being a bit of a negative, and understandably so, because if you have a situation where you, for example, have renamed a folder outside of Lightroom, renamed photos, moved things around outside of Lightroom, now the catalog doesn't match your hard drive, you've got a mess. My most popular video training course of all time is cleaning up your mess in Lightroom Classic, because so many photographers have created a mess. And this is why photographers who have not used Lightroom Classic sometimes like to poke a little bit of fun at us, those of us who have chosen to use Lightroom Classic in their workflow. But the thing with the catalog is that it also has some really tremendous advantages. And so, for example, if I browse all photographs, now this is a demo catalog, this has less than 3,800 photos, whereas my real catalog is almost 400,000 photos. But I can go to all photographs and instantly browse everything, because by default, when I import my photos, I'm generating standard previews. And so I'm able to see all of my images. Even if my hard drive is disconnected from the computer, I can still see the various photos. I can see thumbnails and previews for my images. And so that gives me some great flexibility. I can also filter based on the various criteria. The way I describe this is whatever you can remember about your photos, you can probably use it to find some pictures. So for example, in the grid view display here in Lightroom, in the library module, we have the library filter bar up at the top, and I can say, let's go under attribute, and let me see all my 3-star or greater images, or all my 2-star or greater images, or let me see the red color label images that I still need to review, or let me see all of the video clips, for example. So videos rather than still photos. Or what other details? Metadata. We'll get out of videos there. In fact, get out of the attributes altogether and browsing. And I'm going to actually switch this one to date. And so if we look at all pictures, I can say, well, only show me the photos that were captured with this particular camera, and maybe with the 150 to 600 millimeter lens, a couple different versions of that lens that I use. Maybe I'm looking for narrow depth of field, and so I could choose to use the lens aperture, for example, and say, well, something in the, no more than f8, for example, so that I can find photos that might have narrow depth of field. Or I could switch that to the shutter speed. So if I choose shutter speed as my filter and say, I just want to see relatively, now this is a long lens, so that's not the best example. Let's go back to all lenses, and let's just see anything more than 1 second, 1 second or more. And so of course this includes, various long exposures, because I'm able to filter across my entire catalog quickly and easily. I don't know if that demo could possibly make clear just how significant a benefit that I think this can be, because this enables me to filter across my entire catalog. And just as fast as everything has been just now, it's equally fast when I'm using my real catalog with almost 400,000 photos. And so to me, it's a tremendous benefit being able to browse all of my images and filter across the entire catalog. So if I don't know which folder an image is in, that's no problem, because I can still filter my images across the entire catalog based on whatever details. And that can include a date, including, for example, I can go through and say, well, okay, I remember it was in 2018 and it was either March or April, or it was definitely in April and it was, between the 15th and the 28th, or, whatever particular details I can remember. I can really drill down into specific details, specific criteria that I'm filtering based on, again, across the entire catalog all at once. And now I forget who, Tommy, I think, brought up the map module, another one of my favorite features. And so in Lightroom, I'll just go ahead and switch into the map module and give that a chance to load. Because I'm using a camera that has a built-in GPS receiver, I have the ability to browse my photos based on where they were captured. And so to me, for someone who, I guess the map makes clear, I obviously travel a fair amount for my photography. And so to be able to see where I captured my photos and to be able to, be reminded of, oh yeah, we were at this little island off the west coast of Africa and there were some really dramatic landscapes. And so maybe that's a photo that I would like to use. So not only can I be reminded of where I captured a particular photo, sometimes I locate a photo because I'm looking at the map and it reminds me of some little detail. So that's a feature that I really appreciate in Lightroom Classic. In the cloud-based version of Lightroom, to be fair, I should point out, let's see, do these, I believe. Let's go look. I'm going to look at the info tab here. And yes, sure enough. So you can take a look right here on the metadata, the info panel in Lightroom. In fact, let me go back here and just make sure. There we are. Just want to make sure that my face is hidden, essentially. Turn off that webcam. So you can see the various metadata, fairly straightforward, fairly basic. But down at the bottom is a thumbnail for the map. And that is not the same as the map module, in fairness. But that does show me where on the map that photo was captured, assuming, of course, that I have GPS coordinates and metadata for the photo. And if I click on that map, there's no map there. Well, there's the thumbnail for the map. But if I click on that thumbnail of the map, that will open up my default web browser and take me to Google Maps so that I can see that exact location on the map. So while there isn't a map module in the cloud-based version of Lightroom, it still has some of that functionality. I really enjoy the map module. If the cloud-based version had a map module, that would get me even closer to making the full switch from Lightroom Classic to the cloud-based version of Lightroom. But, again, I'll also keep in mind Lightroom, the cloud-based version, is a newer application compared to Lightroom Classic. So understandably, the features aren't all there yet. Although, let's go back for our cloud-based photos. And again, in this case, I don't have a huge number of images, but I demonstrated some of the filtering capabilities across the entire catalog in Lightroom Classic. One feature that Lightroom has for cloud-based photos that Lightroom Classic doesn't have at all is image analysis. And so we can search based on anything. And so you'll just have to take my word. Well, you don't have to take my word for it, but we'll take a look at keywords once we get there. But I have not keyworded the things I'm going to search for. At least I probably haven't because I don't remember. Let's just do a search. So I'm going to do a text-based search up at the top here. I'm browsing all photos. So I'm seeing all of my images in my entire cloud-based catalog, as it were, but without the use of a catalog. So I don't have to worry. I can go outside of Lightroom and it's no problem. I can only get to my cloud-based images from within Lightroom, the Lightroom ecosystem. But if I go local, I can go rename a folder outside of Lightroom, go back to my local tab, and the renamed folder shows up with its updated name. So I don't have to deal with the catalog, which is one of the benefits of the cloud-based version of Lightroom. So let's try statue. Let's see if the Moai statues will pop up. They do. And only the statues. I don't have any other pictures of statues. Let's see. I don't know if I have any pictures of boats. So let's search for boat. I do. 2 boats. There we go. These, and then let me, tree, since I noticed there's a tree there. So there's some trees. But look, I kept the panel. In fact, let me hide my face so that I can show you. Here's the keywords. So this photo has behind the photo as a keyword. And this photo doesn't have a keyword. That has Instagram share as a keyword. This one also Instagram share, meaning that I've shared it to Instagram. This one is from the Palouse, and it had a red color label when I migrated from the classic version of Lightroom. Likewise there. Easter Island and Moai, and Easter Island and Moai, and no keywords at all. So Lightroom found these images by image analysis. And so I can perform a search. Let's try airplane, for example. There we go, some crop dusters along with a little aerobatic plane, and etc. Whatever the case might be. Window, just because I happen to see that there's a window in the picture and there's several other windows. So we can search by image analysis for cloud-based photos, which is a potentially huge advantage. I would love for this to be added to Lightroom Classic. I'm not holding my breath. I suspect that might be one of those features that gets held back trying to convince people they should be using the cloud-based version of Lightroom. And then switching over to Adobe Bridge, which is a little bit more straightforward in terms of the capabilities. You still have the same basic features across the board except for Lightroom. Some of you maybe saw this in a recent Ask Tim Gray. So in Lightroom Classic and Adobe Bridge and Lightroom, the non-classic version, I can use star ratings to identify favorites. I can use pick and reject flags to identify favorites versus outtakes, for example. In the cloud-based version of Lightroom, we do not have color labels. I mentioned that label_red keyword that was added to an image that I migrated from Lightroom Classic to Lightroom. That's because the photo had a red color label, but Lightroom cloud-based does not support color labels. And so that's unfortunate because I like using color labels. We could use, fake keywords as a bit of a workaround, but color labels are not currently supported in Lightroom. I hope that changes. Also, at the moment, we can only browse a single folder in Lightroom. We can't see photos in subfolders in the cloud-based version of Lightroom, even when browsing locally. I'm sure that's going to change before too long. And so, some of these differences are just differences for now. Others are architectural differences. Lightroom Classic will always have a catalog, whereas Lightroom Cloud, I would say, will never have a catalog. And so if the catalog is bothering you, that's probably reason enough to at least give some thought to using Lightroom, the non-classic version. And so Adobe Bridge being a browser, I just simply browse my photos, and so I can go navigate to the various folders. In this case, I'm in the film strip view. So in fact, let's switch this to a view that'll give us a little bit more in the way of thumbnails, just so that we can see more images, not for any particularly good reason. But we can review, we can filter the images. In Adobe Bridge, it's not always going to be quite as fast. So especially if I'm trying to say on this entire external hard drive, show me all my 5-star rated images, that's going to be a little bit slower in Adobe Bridge. And so if you have a tendency to need to search across a large swath of your photos, Bridge is going to be a little bit slower, but it's also simpler. There's less to worry about. You don't need to worry about making changes in the operating system versus in Adobe Bridge, whereas with Lightroom Classic, that's a big issue. You don't have cloud-based storage at all in Adobe Bridge, so that's something to consider. But you can always use other methods to synchronize photos to the cloud, for example. You could synchronize to your smartphone, for example, or you can export photos. You can make copies of photos, essentially, process images out of Adobe Bridge, and then you could bring them into Lightroom, the cloud-based version, only for those photos that you want to have available on your smartphone, for example. So there's other ways that we can, of course, work around these issues. The core question is, what's the fundamental tool you're going to use in your workflow? And I would say especially when it comes to organizing. I mentioned collections in Adobe Bridge, and so if we take a look down here, I have Palouse favorites. Well, that collection relates to a folder that no longer exists. And this, of course, is part of the challenge because I teach so much with these different tools. I often do make changes. I often intentionally break things. But I mentioned earlier that we can only see photos in collections in Adobe Bridge if the source is available. And so in this case, these are stored, the photos that are in these collections are stored on external hard drives, and those external hard drives are not currently connected to the computer, and so I can't see them. So Bridge has some inherent limitations by virtue of just being a browser. It also is simpler. and I mean that in a good way in this sense. It's simpler in terms of being able to have a more streamlined and just simple workflow. I just want to see my photos. I'm going to organize them with a folder structure, maybe use some star ratings. I'll open them up in Photoshop via Camera Raw in the case of raw captures. So Bridge is really sort of the simpler approach when it comes to that overall workflow. And oftentimes simplicity can be a really good thing, as I'm sure you can appreciate. And so let's take a look here. Well, in fact, let's come back and take a look at a little bit of a summary of sorts in terms of these applications that we've been talking about. And I know there's been some questions coming in. I'll try to get to as many of those as possible. But first and foremost, let's talk about how we choose among these different tools, among these different applications. And hopefully the little demonstration there, the talk I've been giving so far gives you a pretty good sense of that. But just to sort of summarize that, the cloud-based, as it were, version of Lightroom, the non-classic version of Lightroom, the version of Lightroom that seemed to have been created to confuse us about what Lightroom actually was. So Lightroom, sort of cloud-based version, for that, I would say one of the reasons you might choose this is if cloud storage is a priority. That doesn't mean you should only use this version of Lightroom if you want all of your photos in the cloud. It's just that you actually do want to be able to store photos in the cloud, even if it's a small percentage, so that you can have them on your mobile devices, you can access them in a web browser, you can just have them backed up for peace of mind. If you do not want your photos in the cloud, then probably I would suggest either Lightroom Classic or Bridge rather than this version of Lightroom. It is really cloud focused, and so why would you use it if you're not interested in the cloud? That's not to say you can't. You absolutely could use this version of Lightroom, only use the local tab, never put any photos in the cloud. That is an option, but because the cloud is such a core feature in Lightroom, if you're not using the cloud, then maybe it's not the right version of Lightroom for you. It's not an absolute, but just something to think about. It provides basic local browsing as a bonus. It's a bit limited at the moment. You can't browse, as I mentioned, multiple folders at the same time. You can't browse photos in subfolders of the folder that's currently selected. So there's some limitations there. I'm sure that's going to improve with time. But for now, at least, think of local browsing as sort of the secondary priority. Lightroom is really focused on cloud-based storage. Local browsing is a new addition that is still a little bit limited in terms of feature set. Lightroom does provide, I think, a nice integrated workflow. Everything's in one place. We can browse our photos, select which photos we want to see on that left panel. We can adjust the editing controls. We can optimize our photos with the controls on the right panel, review metadata, add keywords again on that right panel. So we sort of have just everything all cohesively in one place rather than switching among modules in Lightroom Classic. So it does feel a bit more integrated, a little simpler and easier, I would say. And minor learning curve though. So if you've been using Adobe Bridge, then the local browsing in Lightroom is probably going to be pretty straightforward for you. Obviously, there might be some learning curve involved with cloud-based storage if you're going to make use of that. So some things to think about in that regard. For Lightroom Classic, first and foremost, local storage is a priority. If you, like me, really want to know that your photos are right here on this hard drive, and they're backed up to this other hard drive, and also backed up to this other hard drive, and backed up to the cloud just for an offsite additional backup. But if local storage is really your priority, then Lightroom Classic is probably a good option to look at. Obviously, Adobe Bridge falls into that category as well. If cloud synchronization is a bonus, if you'd like to have that synchronization, because in the in the classic version of Lightroom, we can synchronize individual collections. And so we can group images into a collection, which is like an album in Lightroom or Bridge. We can group photos, and then we can enable synchronization so that proxies of those images, not the original raw capture, but proxies of those images will be synchronized to the cloud so that we can access them from our mobile devices, from a web browser, etc. Integrated. So Lightroom Classic has an integrated workflow, but it is modularized. So in fairness, admittedly, it does feel a little bit more clunky. If I'm working in the develop module and I want to change the folder of photos that I'm browsing, I have to switch back to the library module, go over to the left panel, switch folders, now come back to the develop module. It's not as streamlined as we have with Lightroom. And then the catalog has benefits, as I demonstrated, being able to search across the entire catalog, but there's also risks. You've got to understand the catalog if you're going to use Lightroom Classic. You've got to keep in mind, do not make any changes outside of Lightroom. Everything gets started within Lightroom. And then there's a moderate learning curve. More so, I would say, than with Lightroom, the cloud-based version. Definitely considerably more of a learning curve than with Adobe Bridge, because you have to take into account that catalog. And then Bridge, local storage is a priority, once again, as I mentioned with Lightroom Classic. And if you have no need for cloud synchronization, because it's not supported in Adobe Bridge in the way that we have the built-in capability to synchronize albums and collections in Lightroom Classic, essentially. Definitely a non-integrated workflow, less integrated, or not quite the same integration. We can open up an image from Bridge. It's going to open by default in Photoshop. If it's a raw capture, that means camera raw. But still, it definitely feels in Bridge that you're using 2 or 3 different applications. You're sort of using Bridge plus camera raw plus Photoshop. In fairness, in Lightroom and Lightroom Classic, you can send photos to Photoshop. So it's not tremendously more complicated, but there's less of an integrated feel when it comes to Bridge. And in part, by the way, because Bridge is not just for Photoshop. Bridge is also the tool for browsing your illustrations that you'll send to Illustrator and your documents that you'll send to InDesign. It is a cohesive browser for the entire Adobe suite. And there's no catalog risk. So Bridge is just a browser. You don't have to worry about going out into the operating system and making changes. And no need to learn new software if you've been using Bridge, which I know many photographers started off using Bridge, possibly went to Lightroom Classic. Some then switched to the cloud-based version of Lightroom. But Bridge, even if you've never used it, it's frankly easier to learn, and there's not as much of a risk because there's no catalog to do harm in, for example. So in Lightroom Classic, I always say, don't start using it until you understand it. Bridge, you can pretty much just dive in because it's just a browser. If you go make changes outside the operating system, it's not going to make any trouble in your workflow. Might confuse you a little bit, but it's not going to create problems in your workflow. And then I promise I will get to some questions here. I know we're running out of time, but briefly, what about the future? We had Bridge for a long time, still do. Then Lightroom came along and got renamed to Lightroom Classic, now the cloud-based version of Lightroom. So what's that going to look like in the future? Maybe we'll meld them all together with a little bit of alchemy and have Adobe Photoshop, Lightroom, Bridge, Classic, Modern. Maybe. No, I'm just kidding. Just having a little fun at Adobe's expense because it's already a bit of a confusing landscape in terms of these applications. As I said right from the start, in many cases within the Adobe Creative Cloud suite of applications, if you have a particular task in mind, there's one application you're probably going to use. When it comes to organizing your photos, there's 3, well really 4 that you might consider. So when it comes to the future, really only Adobe knows, but just some food for thought. One of the things I hear a lot is, will Lightroom Classic disappear? There's no real indications of that other than the fact that Lightroom could be considered a competitor to Lightroom Classic. And so maybe there's an interest at Adobe to streamline things to, reduce the development costs involved in maintaining 2 applications versus just 1. Will Bridge go away? That I don't really see happening because, as I mentioned, Bridge is the glue that binds together all of the applications in the Creative Cloud family. So I don't think that would go away. Will something else replace all of them? That's entirely possible. Or at least might something replace the applications on the photo side? So for example, Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, Camera Raw, Photoshop. There's an argument to be made that an entirely new application could take the place of all of those, bringing all the things we need into a single place so we don't have all of these different applications to consider and to try to get to play nice with each other, etc. But ultimately, as I mentioned, only Adobe knows what the future is going to hold. So far, they have demonstrated a commitment to both Lightroom and Lightroom Classic. I can tell you from personal experience, being that I am fortunately able to sit at the table from time to time and give feedback to Adobe, that they take the feedback very seriously, both with Lightroom and Lightroom Classic. Adobe Bridge obviously is a little bit of different. It's sort of off on its own little tangent because it carries the weight for so many different users of the various Adobe products. But the point being is that we don't know what the future is going to hold. I'm sure it'll change. Those of you that maybe had used Apple's Aperture certainly appreciate the pain of having software discontinued. I'm sure there will be more changes on the horizon. We just don't know exactly what those changes are actually going to translate into. So I will move along here to the questions. We've got just a few more minutes. Well, technically about a minute to go here, but I do want to at least cover a few questions. So I'll go a little into overtime for that. As a quick reminder though, first of all, thank you so much for joining me for this presentation. I appreciate all the great comments. Obviously, I'm so busy talking, I don't get a chance to catch most of those comments, but hopefully it's still been helpful, even though I can't get to all of those comments along the way. But I'll take a look at those after the fact as well. And then the questions that have been submitted. And so let me actually just bring this up and take a look at some of the questions here. I found Lightroom to be slow. So, Bob, I'm assuming you're referring to the cloud-based version of Lightroom, indicating that he's had some issues. Yeah, and I see the clarification here, Lightroom Classic. So that Lightroom has had some stability issues. And I will say, yes, I have had some issues with Lightroom where from time to time things are not responsive. I have to quit and restart and then everything's back to normal. And so I would say among the three, I've never felt that Adobe Bridge had the best performance. I felt that Lightroom Classic has generally been pretty stable. The cloud-based version of Lightroom, I would say, is the one that I found to be the most unstable, at least recently. And I'm sure, from time to time, Adobe does go into their credit and sort of focus on performance and stability with a release that really just prioritizes that. But yes, it's not just you. It is something that I've observed as well. Why didn't Adobe just name these products differently? I wish I had a good answer for that. I wish Adobe would have listened to me and some of the others who said, this is way too confusing. Please don't do this. Yeah, if you work in Lightroom local, so if you're working in the cloud-based version of Lightroom, but you're using that local tab, can you later import those photos into Lightroom Classic and will you lose your information? So yes, you can import those photos into Lightroom Classic and you will preserve the information because for that local storage, metadata updates are written out to the files by default. So in the case of raw captures, that would be the XMP option. So an XMP sidecar file is created for that. Really good question are there limits to how many images can be uploaded to the cloud? Yes, I mean no. Which is to say, there's no limit except the storage capacity that your plan includes. And so I think the default photography plan, don't quote me exactly on the numbers, but I think it starts at 20 gigabytes for the very basic plan, but you can also get 1 terabyte. And then if you get the everything bundle, as it were, of apps, I think that starts at 200 gigabytes, but there's a 1 terabyte option. But you can also add 1 terabyte at a time, meaning, it's typically around about $10 per terabyte per month. So you're only limited by the storage capacity that your subscription includes, but you can add more storage if that becomes necessary. And so there's not really a limit there's not really a limit as long as you're willing to pay for the extra storage space. How about that? And so if you have missing photos in Lightroom Classic, what will happen if you convert to Lightroom? They'll effectively still be, well, I was going to say missing, but that's not the right word to use here. They'll be non-existent in the context of Lightroom. And so when you migrate, so within the Lightroom cloud-focused version, the non-classic version, there is a feature that enables you to migrate from Lightroom Classic. There's also a feature, by the way, that enables you to migrate from Apple Photos. And so when you do that, it will analyze your catalog and it'll tell you about missing photos if there are any. I strongly recommend that you resolve all of that, any of the missing photos and folders, get that taken care of before you migrate to the cloud-based version if you're interested in doing that. And if you delete, so one of the key features, I suppose you could say, cloud-based storage. If you delete a cloud-based photo from anywhere, it is deleted from everywhere. And so Lightroom Classic would be different in that regard. But if we have a photo in Lightroom, the cloud-based version that is, we import it and we move it to the cloud, and then I'm on my phone and I feel like I have too many photos in Lightroom on my phone, so I delete. I'm not just deleting from my phone, I'm deleting from Lightroom. I'm deleting from my cloud-based storage. And so that gets rid of everything. And let's see here. So Linda, good question. What's my workflow? Well, my workflow is I have to know about all of these tools so that I can help you. But my personal workflow still revolves around Lightroom Classic. And so for my real library of photos, that's all in Lightroom Classic. It's almost 400,000 photos. I am periodically going through and trying to delete some of the outtakes, the garbage that I really don't need, because I'm not good about deleting, because I always worry I'm going to want that photo later. But so I'm using Lightroom Classic in part because I love being able to search across my entire catalog. I love the map module. And so those two features alone really are compelling to me personally. And of course, I had a good instructor who taught me well not to work outside of Lightroom Classic, so I don't have a mess in my catalog either. And so for me, Lightroom Classic makes the most sense. But I will say, I've done consultations with many, many photographers and have seen varying degrees of messes that they've created. And to be perfectly honest with you, sometimes I work with a client and I tell them, I don't think you should be using Lightroom Classic, because you're not comfortable with this workflow, and you're more likely to go outside of Lightroom and make changes. So Lightroom Classic is not a good solution if you don't understand how to work with Lightroom properly. It's really, really important. Whereas with Lightroom, the cloud-based version and Adobe Bridge, much more forgiving. And so if you created a huge mess in Lightroom Classic, either you might consider starting over with a fresh catalog and learn your lesson and start using a proper workflow where you're not going outside of Lightroom Classic, or you might consider using either Adobe Bridge or Lightroom that is cloud-based focus. Yes, good, excellent question. Is Lightroom Cloud non-destructive so you can go back to the original photo? Thank you for asking that question, actually. In all cases, when we're talking about processing with Camera Raw, now with Bridge it gets a little bit maybe messier, because now we're talking about opening a photo in Photoshop. So if it were a JPEG that we opened in Photoshop, but in Lightroom Classic and Lightroom Cloud, when we're editing our pictures, that is all 100% non-destructive. We can always get back to the original image. And let's see here. We're going just a little bit over time. Hopefully you'll bear with me and not mind if I spend a little extra time answering questions. Let's see here. Local storage and cloud storage. Yeah, real good question here, George. And so if you have the cloud-based version of Lightroom and on your computer you're using both local and cloud-based storage, then you go to a shared computer. You go to the local library and go to a web browser, or on your smartphone or your tablet. Which photos will you see? Only your cloud-based photos. In order to see local photos, they need to be available locally. And so, for example, if you're going to use a cloud-based version of Lightroom and you are using both local and cloud-based storage, and you have a desktop and a laptop, I would put your photos that are local storage on an external hard drive so you could swap the hard drive between computers. But that local tab, it's quite literally named, meaning that you are only able to browse photos that are local to you right now, meaning available on your computer. And so cloud-based photos are available essentially from anywhere with an internet connection anyway. And so that gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of the photos that are stored in the cloud, but local really means available right here on this computer that you're using. So can you use Lightroom Cloud as a backup system in conjunction with Backblaze? Not exactly, because Backblaze cannot back up your cloud-based storage. And with cloud-based storage, everything is not necessarily also stored locally. There is an option to store locals if you have enough capacity. So in Preferences in the cloud-based version of Lightroom, you can choose the option to store copies of originals on your local hard drive. You just need to make sure that you have enough capacity for that, and then Backblaze could be used to back up that. But there isn't a way to use an external backup solution directly with the various backup solutions with the cloud-based photos. And then Doug's question here. Let's see. Yeah, so in Lightroom Classic, you can share via a collection, and then that'll be available elsewhere, including Lightroom, the desktop. But one of the things that I want to emphasize is that if you're using Lightroom, it should only be one desktop version. I do not recommend that you use both Lightroom Classic and the cloud-based version of Lightroom in your workflow. And another good comment here is that the cloud-based version of Lightroom does not currently support, and it's not a brand new application, but it does not currently support plugins. And so plugins are available for Lightroom Classic, available for Photoshop, but they're not available for the cloud-based version of Lightroom. That said, from Lightroom, you can send photos to Photoshop, and then you could access your various plugins from directly within Photoshop. And yes, so if I say Lightroom, in this context at least, hopefully whenever I mean classic, I actually say the word classic. So if I otherwise say Lightroom in this context, that would be the cloud-based version of the desktop application, and then the mobile app and the web browser. Those are just sort of, I would say, bonus features. And let's see here. Is there any reason not to use Lightroom Classic with your Adobe Cloud photos, only to avoid confusion? And so if you have photos that have been added to the Lightroom Cloud ecosystem, they can be accessed. So for example, if you capture a new photo using the Lightroom mobile application, it'll show up in Lightroom Classic. I don't like that hybrid workflow. And so in fact, I had an article in a recent issue of Pixology magazine, relatively recent in any event, that talked about migrating those photos from the cloud to local, and that's an approach I recommend, because if you're mixing and matching, if you're using cloud-based storage, sort of you should be using Lightroom Cloud, not Lightroom Classic. Obviously, it's not quite as simple as that, since we have a variety of different things to take into account in that regard. So if you occasionally use Lightroom cloud-based to edit photos, can you get the sidecar files into your Lightroom Classic catalog if the photos are not already in Lightroom Classic? So one of the reasons I don't recommend using both applications with the same photos is that if you make an update to a photo on the local tab in Lightroom, the cloud-based version, that's not going to update in the Lightroom Classic application. Instead, you'll just get a metadata mismatch, and that includes with adjustments. And so if the photo is not in Lightroom, then you could import it into Lightroom and pull in those adjustments. Or if the photo had already been there, then you could import the metadata, but that starts to get a little bit messy, so it's not really something that I recommend. And let's see. Yeah, so for scenarios where you're doing events, I would say that Lightroom Classic is going to render those photos not as fast as other tools. And so I would say that, something like Photo Mechanic is faster. So if you're, in fact, I'll maybe follow up with you on this particular question, but there's going to be performance differences. So Lightroom Classic tends to be a little bit slow when it comes to rendering the previews. Lightroom Cloud on the local tab tends to be pretty fast. Bridge tends to be pretty fast, not as fast as something like Photo Mechanic. And so, keeping in mind, today I've been talking about these Adobe applications. There's other applications beyond what Adobe offers that might offer some additional advantages. And certainly Photo Mechanic is a popular solution in terms of being able to just very, very quickly browse your photos and get through them really quickly. All right. It looks like, we've gone more than 10 minutes overtime. So I do apologize for keeping you a little bit late, but I really appreciate you joining me for today's presentation. I appreciate you sticking around for some of the questions and answers here. I hope that all of this has been really helpful to give you a better sense of these different applications, especially some of the more recent changes that you might not have been aware of, such as that local browsing in the cloud-based version of Lightroom, and to give you a better sense of which might be the right solution for you, even if you're just thinking sort of longer term. Maybe you're thinking of going toward the cloud-based version, but you want to get Lightroom Classic all cleaned up first, or you're fed up with Lightroom Classic and you're going to revert to Adobe Bridge. But I hope that the information that I've shared today has been helpful to give you a better sense of what the options are, a better idea of what the right solution might be for you both now and maybe a little bit further down the line, maybe as your needs change as well. So thank you all once again very, very much. I appreciate you tuning in. I hope to see you again for another presentation as part of the GreyLearning live webinar series. And once again, thanks so much, and I hope you enjoyed today's presentation as much as I did.